one of our last events for this. It's been a very busy year. Many interesting events in Ukrainian studies. The title of today's talk is Language Issues as a Pretext for Military Intervention, the War in Ukraine and its Balkan Connection. Our speaker is Robert Greenberg. Professor Robert Greenberg is an award-winning teacher and researcher. He's a visiting scholar this semester here at the Harriman Institute, a professor of linguistics, and dean of the Faculty of Arts at the University of Auckland. He examines social linguistic issues in the Slavic world, especially the link between language and identity. He completed his book, Language and Identity in the Balkans, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2004. And a second edition was published 4 years later in 2008. He completed his book on his last time as a visiting scholar at Columbia. And he began looking at the connection between the Balkan wars of the 1990s and the war in Ukraine in 2015. Professor Greenberg has taught at Georgetown, UNC Chapel Hill, and Yale. And beginning in May, will be a visiting professor at the Slavic Eurasian Research Center in Hokkaido University, before returning to his post at Auckland in July. So welcome, Professor Greenberg.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Really grateful to you, Mark, for that very generous introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here with you today to talk about this subject, which I've, as was mentioned, started to research in 2015. At that point, I was invited to the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute for a conference. There was later a book published called The Battle for Ukrainian by Harvard University Press. And I was invited to speak about when is a language, the case of the former Yugoslavia. It seemed at the time a rather random invitation because I didn't really know a lot about what could be the possible connection between the situation in the Balkans in the 1990s and before that, of course, which led to the wars in the 90s, and what had just happened in Ukraine in the 2014 period with the Euromaidan events and the overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych and the whole change in the sociolinguistic, political, cultural landscape in eastern and southern Ukraine with the annexation of Crimea that had occurred and the insurgency, referenda, and fighting that was ongoing in Donbass at that time. Between that time and 2022, there were 13,000 dead in the wars that occurred. So though many people today believe the war started in 22, obviously the fighting started in 2014. So I for a long time, and especially when I went to give that talk in 2015, I thought that most of this were random parallels. Perhaps often there are historical parallels that we find. But when I dug a little deeper and over the last 7 or so years, I do think that there is a really strong Balkan connection, which I hope to demonstrate today in this talk. Some of this has to do with the language situation, but also just a mindset that I would like to talk about, and a link between Vladimir Putin and Slobodan Milošević, and in the way that they have conceived of the world around them, their political and militaristic journeles that led to such terrible conflicts and suffering. I'm a sociolinguist, as was mentioned. I do look at language from an anthropological linguistic perspective, which means really I look at people's attitudes towards their language, the language status that their language may achieve, and conflicts around language that begin really on the bottom-up level. But I also have to look at top-down efforts on language, which is the whole area of language planning and policy. As the title shows you, the war often in these conflicts, we see the language issues become a pretext for military action. And most directly, we saw that, as we'll see soon in slide 2, in Crimea, where really very soon after the ouster of Yanukovych in 2014, We have the military troops of the Russian Federation showing up in Crimea, a referendum hastily organized, and the annexation of Crimea. And language is used primarily at that time as one of those flashpoints that is brought up. And the rescinding of Russophone rights was talked about, and I'll show you a bit of that. These parallels exist also with the former Yugoslavia, and I will show you some of that. Then we'll go in later in my talk to my evidence that makes me show you that this is not simply a matter of coincidence, but I do think there's a direct connection between the wars in the Balkans in the 90s and the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and the events between 2014 and 2022. I then show you what those language attitudes and policies of lobby states are. So it would be Russia and Serbia in this case. I look at lobby states. I'll look at a theory of ethnic bargaining to explain that to you. And how actually those policies seem to fail miserably in terms of what the impact is on the ethnic kin that these lobby states are lobbying for. So there'll be a model ethnic kin on one side of a border with a home country, lobby state on the other side of the border, the policies that that lobby state has put in place to support the ethnic kin, and what actually transpires after those mechanisms are put in place. And then I'll wrap it up after that. So please, by the way, if for whatever reason I get too enthusiastic in pressing space bar and I skip a slide, that can be remedied. So don't be shy, just let me know. Doing this blindly is often challenging. So moving right on to our first slide. My starting point is to give you a little bit of background on the language situation in Ukraine between independence or pre-independence, 1989 and today. And I refer to the work of Alla Nidashkivska, who has a 2021 article on language ideology. And particularly she speaks about native language activism in Ukraine and how the native language of Ukrainian, is seen as a symbol of broader unity for Ukrainian people. And there is she demonstrates native language activism through social media and other means as the symbol also of this unified identity, Ukrainian identity. The dates here are pretty helpful because those of you who are familiar with the situation in Ukraine know that it had been very much, particularly Eastern and Southern Ukraine, identified in the media, and there was quite a lot of popular press in 2022 that spoke about this as Russian speaking, including President Volodymyr Zelensky coming from Southern Ukraine and in the East there, native language being Russian. Vladimir Zelensky, and we have the Zelensky effect talk here not that long ago, where he comes out changing to a Ukrainophone during all this time. So you have these shifts. My point here is that for a long time, Eastern and Southern Ukraine had been dominated by either politically by the Russian Empire, culturally by the Russian language and culture. And so we see both in the Russian Empire and in the Soviet Union, the language policies in the Soviet Union were that the Russian language was an L1, the primary language of common communication, broader communication among all the nations and nationalities of the Soviet Union. And but they had a policy under Lenin and later of supporting the languages of the individual republics from Ukrainian, Belarusian, or Belarusian, as we used to call it, Lithuanian, all the Baltic languages, all the 15 republics. So those where you've often had a status of L2. They were supported through official channels with grammars and academies of science and so on and so forth. But the dominant language of the Soviet Union, as most sociolinguists would agree, was Russian. There was a very strong tendency, therefore, to Russify Ukraine linguistically and probably culturally as well. So in 1989, as the Soviet Union is beginning to disintegrate, and the state language, the official state language of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic is becoming Ukrainian. We also then see, as you see in this slide, that there were attempts to actually promote the status of Ukrainian as a state language, first in the first initial years of independence in the early 90s. And then after the Orange Revolution in 2004, these efforts continue. Then you see on this list in 2012, the Kivalov-Kolesnichenko law. So we had a change in presidents in 2010. Viktor Yanukovych becomes president, and he has a pro-Russian policy, and then he weakens the status of Ukrainian as a state language, promoting Russian as a second state language in regions where more than 10% of the population were speakers of Russian. And so this is seen as an effort to weaken, and Nidashkivska speaks of this in her article, weaken the status of Ukrainian. After the overthrow of Yanukovych in 2014, we have the rise of Petro Poroshenko and his law 5670D, I believe it is there, you see it, in 2019, which restores much of the status of Ukrainian as a state language and has all sorts of provisions around the use of Ukrainian in media and in all those, so like 90% of certain media have to be in Ukrainian and the like. So we see a reassertion of the status of Ukrainian. This is in a place where, as we might hear from some of those popular sources, where there was a large Russophone population in eastern and southern Ukraine. I mentioned the annexation of Crimea before. Initially, when the overthrow of Yanukovych occurs, social media in the Russian social media is full of rumors and innuendo that the status of the Russian language will now change in Ukraine. And there is in fact a law that comes before the Ukrainian parliament to rescind the Kivalov-Kolesnichenko law of 2012. So we're going back to 2014 now. So that slide before, which showed the law that diminished the status of the Ukrainian language and elevated the status of the Russian language. By the way, when I spoke about this at Harvard in 2015, this was all part of also a broader effort in Yanukovych's time to comply with some of these European charters on regional and minority languages. And that was one of the things I talked about at that lecture, but it goes a little bit beyond the scope of this one. This idea that you have so many languages and minority and regional languages, and which ones are you going to maintain as regional and minority languages, and which ones may you elevate to state language level. So this is one of the things that actually comes into effect at that time. It'd be interesting perhaps to look at the status of the Ukrainian compliance with the charter. It's difficult to comply with these things under the current conditions, but this is something that I do look at in my broader research. As I said, you can see the demographics of Crimea with over 58%, and one of the census that I looked at the time showing that they proclaim themselves to be Russian and Russian speaking. But you also have these rumors of the language being threatened. This has been one of the, I would say, refrains that perhaps led up very soon after to the military intervention and the annexation of Crimea. And I think also accompanied us on the journey to referenda in Donetsk and Luhansk, which led to the establishment of breakaway regions, very similar to breakaway regions that started to appear in the former Yugoslav landscape. So Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina, a breakaway region of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Republika Srpska Krajina, a breakaway region of the Republic of Croatia. These are republics declaring their independence in '91 and then breakaway regions. It's also very much reminiscent, and only as I say reminiscent, of Slobodan Milošević's speech, when anybody goes that far back to 1989, on the confluence of the Sava and Danube rivers, where he proclaimed that the Serbs of Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo have the right to self-determination. If the Croats have the right to self-determination within Croatia, then the Serbs have this right to self-determination within their territory. They have the right to break away, decide to stay with Yugoslavia, with Serbia in a broader state, or to join or to become independent. Very similar rhetoric, very similar kinds of turns of events occur in 2014 in eastern and southern Ukraine. Again, seems to be a parallel, but there might be more to it. Interestingly, though, if you start to look at Putin's speeches, in his speech in 2014 about the annexation of Crimea, he invokes a Yugoslav precedent, namely the Kosovo precedent. And we'll come back to that in a later slide. But I do think that these invocations of what happened in Kosovo, and especially if you add, as you'll soon see, a few other elements, makes this quite a perfect storm for not just a random parallel, but a really clear and I would say obliterated kind of link between what happens in the Balkans, Milošević's mindset, his ideologies, and what happens in Ukraine today. So I have skipped my slides here. I'm just going to go back.
You're still on the Crimea slide.
Yes, thank you very much. So the next slide is really about the ideas I hinted to earlier about linguistic kin. And there's a political scientist, Erin Jen, 2007, a theory of ethnic bargaining, which I would refer to here. She had a previous article on the same subject, a shorter one if you don't want to read the whole 2007 Cornell University Press book on the same subject. She looked actually at the Hungarians of Vojvodina and others, but that was her case study. And what I think is particularly worth noting in her study is the role of the lobby state, which I'm going to focus on today. A minority in a home country with a larger majority. So let's take Serbs in Croatia, or if you had ethnic Russians in quotes, or let's say those Russians, the people in Crimea who might have identified as Russian, who a Russian minority, not necessarily a Ukrainian, Russian-speaking Ukrainian, and there's an important difference there. Those who identify as ethnic Russian versus those who might identify as Ukrainian in a sort of more civic identity. In any case, the radicalization that minority might undergo has to do with several factors, and she puts this in sort of how repressive is the majority within that home country. So Croats in newly independent Croatia, how oppressive would they be towards the Serb minority? And how supportive would the lobby state be, both in not just rhetoric, but in invoking historical precedents, and then providing certain policy changes or policy implementations of certain policies to support that minority. Obviously, you also then can go a step further, and the direct supply of aid, weapons, and other such interventions from the lobby state. So I think that what we see in both cases of the Balkans and in Serbia in particular, and Milošević's Serbia and Putin's Russia, is this lobby state being had it not been as supported as it is, we are likely to see any of these events take place, because the ethnic minority, whatever that minority might be within the home state, would not be as emboldened or as radicalized in their demands for their collective rights to be fulfilled by the majority of that state. So both Serbia and Kosovo and Russia had lobbied for the rights of their transnational kin. These are two issues relating to the breakup of multilingual, multinational communist states. of those internal borders of the Soviet republics, just as the internal borders of the Yugoslav republics did not correspond to the ethnic or linguistic ones often, and therefore you end up with large swaths of populations outside the borders of the new mother state or the new home state. This is an ongoing issue for Russia with, as we know from the Baltic states, now in Ukraine, Georgia, Transnistria, some frozen conflicts that began in the 90s and still have not been resolved as well. So we have the Serbs in northern Kosovo, which is still an ongoing issue. And I have to say, even post-invasion, Putin's invasion of 2022, there has been more unrest in northern Kosovo among Serbs who still feel aggrieved and still get support from the lobby state of Serbia, despite the agreement between Belgrade and Pristina on supposedly normalizing relations. But there's a whole talk about that next week here online, which I urge you to attend. So this is a policy that I think is shared by both. Again, seems to be an interesting parallel. Maybe there's more to it. And I do think I should start talking about why I think there is more to it. The relationship between Milošević's Serbia in the 90s and Putin's, Russia at the time, the Russian Federation, I think is something that is worth talking about now. And going back to the year 1999 in particular, a very key year, because as you see on this slide, NATO, Russia, and Yugoslavia or Serbia are sort of the sujet du jour of that time. We have the NATO bombing campaign of Yugoslavia to reverse ethnic cleansing in Kosovo occurring between March 24th, 1999 and June 10th. A very unprecedented sort of intervention of NATO on territory when it was not a defensive act on behalf of a NATO country. Kosovo Albanians were not part of NATO, but NATO engages in this campaign. And Putin is not yet president of Russia, though, at this time. It is Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin. However, as I point out here, he wasn't far from the rising to power. He becomes prime minister of the Russian Federation in August, just 2 months after the end of the bombing campaign. And by all accounts, he was very keenly aware of what was going on in the former Yugoslavia, and that this NATO action is, just put a little star next to that, because if you listen to anything that comes out of Russia today, there's a huge suspicion of anything NATO is up to vis-a-vis Russia. And I think that suspicion has one of its origins in the 1999 bombing campaign of Yugoslavia, of an ally to Russia. During the bombing campaign, the parliaments of the Russian Federation and of Belarus, not of Ukraine, interestingly, invited Yugoslavia, then called the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, to join them in some kind of union, political union. It never happened, but it was symbolic of the fact that both the Russian government at the time and the Belarusian government under Lukashenko supported Yugoslavia in its stance against the West and NATO during the bombing campaign. As you can see on the slide, March 24th, the day of the bombing campaign started, Yevgeny Primakov, the Russian foreign minister, is on his way to Washington, but just tells the pilot turn around, go back to Moscow, apparently. Relations are starting to sour over this, or at least to be put a little bit on ice at the time, given what was happening and the bombing campaign. By the way, this March 24th, 2023, when Serbia was having a memorial service for the bombing campaign in Belgrade, one of it prominently mentioned in the news reports was the presence of the Russian ambassador to Serbia at the event. So again, I do think that history plays an important role here, and historical memory among leaders is something I'll come back to. Also, Russia does a few things, yes, ostensibly supporting the agreement that ends the bombing campaign and saying we won't get in the way as NATO troops come in to Kosovo, creating the Kosovo force, reversing the ethnic cleansing, and also, as is seen here, however, taking a little dig at NATO by reaching Pristina airport unannounced before NATO troops did in 1999. Sort of a small act of defiance noted in the media, maybe just a footnote of history today, but I think also has some significance to reveal whose side the Russian Federation were on in 1999 and how they viewed NATO, not necessarily in a positive way in terms of its role in reversing the ethnic cleansing and bringing to Kosovo's ultimate, I guess, rendering apart from Serbia and independence in 2008. So I do think now, let's look at some of the other linkages between Putin in particular, or Russia in particular, and the Milošević family. I don't think it's a coincidence, as we used to say in the Soviet times, at Denis Luchina, that Boris Milošević was, Slobodan Milošević's brother, was ambassador to Russian Federation exactly in 99, 2000, just as Putin was becoming president, because he was prime minister, in 99 August, but in January 1st, 2000, he becomes president of the Russian Federation and essentially has held that role with a short period as prime minister during a swap of roles with Medvedev, but he's been president ever since, pretty much. There was a disputed election also in Serbia in 2000, and of course, Putin offers to mediate between Milošević and Koštunica, after his overthrow, his wife, Mirjana Marković, and others, his family members, immediate family members, all fled to Russia. Russia has been considered by his family as well as a friendly place. And he sought to travel there while he was in the Hague Tribunal to treat his heart condition. He sought to get permission to travel to Russia for medical treatment. And after he dies in captivity in the Hague Tribunal in the Hague, the Russian parliament condemns the tribunal as being anti-Serbian. So I think there's mounting evidence to show that Milošević was more than just a fixture perhaps in the minds of the Russians, but was a true ally and perhaps even influenced some of the thinking that we might be seeing now in Russian policy, among Russian policymakers, and particularly among the president himself, Vladimir Putin. Similarly, Vladimir Putin in his speeches has been invoking the Yugoslav precedent repeatedly, and there's some popular press items on this last year as well as, but here's one quote that I give you, just on the day of the invasion, February 24th, 2022, about first there was this bloody attack on Belgrade and the NATO bombing is invoked. So this is evidence, Putin uses this idea of the Yugoslav precedent to justify some of his actions and justify the notions that he has put forward of NATO being antagonistic to Russia and having none of, and being against all things Russian and Russian interests. I guess the final straw for me was when in 2012, but then even more so repeated in 2014. Am I calculating, keeping up? Yes. In 2014, yes, this is the Milošević's final farewell address, or alleged final farewell address, circulates in Russia, both in social media and in a poster that is found in a theater illusion. I think it's a funny name that it's in the theater illusion when it's actually illusion, and the actual speech that you're going to soon hear is made up. There's no evidence that this speech actually took place. So it first found on an anonymous blog with a .su domain name, which SU Soviet Union. I still find it quite ironic that it's a .su domain name and that it even still exists. the internet can outlast us all, clearly, and it certainly outlasted the Soviet Union. And you can still find it online, and you can see reports in the also that it appeared in this. And here's a picture of the poster that appeared in Illusion.
Русские.
Oh no,
Я
sorry.
сейчас обращаюсь ко всем
This
русским
is actually.
жителей Украины и Беларуси на Балканах тоже считают русскими. Смотрите на нас и запомните. С вами сделают то же самое, когда вы разобщитесь и дадите слабину. Запад, цепная бешеная собака, вцепится вам в горло. Братья, помните о судьбе Югославии. Не дайте поступить с вами так же. Зачем вам Европа, русские? Трудно найти более самодостаточный народ, чем вы. Это Европа нуждается в вас, но не вы в ней. Вас так много, целых 3 страны, а единства нет. У вас есть все свое, много земли, энергия, топливо, вода, наука, промышленность, культура. Когда у нас была Югославия и мы были едины, мы ощущали себя великой силой, способной свернуть горы. Теперь из-за нашей же глупости, национализма, нежелания слышать друг друга Югославии больше нет. И мы прыщи на политической карте Европы, новые рынки для их дорогого барахла и американской демократии.
So, I mean, it's very plausible. It could have easily been said by Slobodan Milošević, but all the press items and everywhere I look says, no, this is absolutely fake. Not surprising that we've said such a fake news item. I hope you were able to read, those of you who might not understand the Russian, the translation that I put there for you. Of significance here, I think, is this idea that there's somehow this mythical broader unity of all these Slavic peoples, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarusia, or Belarus, that Belarus and Ukraine for this speech belong to Russia. They do not exist. So this idea that we see also from somebody like Joshua Fishman, Language and Nationalism from 1972, who talks about the idea that these people who use nationalism and language issues often talk about these broader unities, sometimes mythologizing them, in fact, to think that they really do exist. So obviously that first statement in the Balkans, we know best, of course. We know that Ukraine, Belarus, and they should not even exist. They should all anyway be part of a Russian Federation. I also think that it is something that we would have seen Serbia say as well. At the time of the war, one of my linguist colleagues in Serbia, why would a linguist be writing an article in an important newspaper? Croatia will lose the war on August 2nd, 1991, even before the war really started in earnest. It had just been maybe a month perhaps, and we weren't sure where this war was going to go. It was a war that started in some of the mixed regions of Croatia, but a linguist saying because of language, Croatia is at fault for this war. We're just defending our Serbian people against domination by another small nation that is claiming that it should exist, but we do not believe that right to, this is a way of weakening our own people and our own nation. So it's sort of looking at this, the way that we often see the narrative right now in Ukraine. Putin in his speeches says that Ukraine is a Leninist plot, and you look at some of this talk in looks at history, meant to weaken Russia. This is one of the things that he has said in some of the more recent speeches as in his interpretation of history. So I think I might have skipped the slide with the poster, but we can always show it to you later. So again, when you listen to Putin's interpretations of history, believing his legitimacy has to do with the fact that these territories are historically Russian territories and Russian speaking. There are parallel claims, as I just mentioned, among the Serb nationalists regarding Serb territories, and that Bosnian Croats, Bosnian or Bosnian Muslims are actually Muslim Serbs and Catholic Serbs, that these nationalities should not have existed. The narrative is that the language rights of the Russians in Ukraine have been threatened since 2014, and similar claims are made, and especially the laws that I mentioned before, the 2014 effort to rescind the language law, and the 2019 law, which elevated again the Ukrainian language as the state language, re-elevated it, and strengthened the Ukrainian language, is again used in 2022 as a pretext for the protection, in quotes, of the Russian minority. And it reminds me of the book Mondegreen that our friend here has translated so ably, where the author is talking about the Russians coming to protect him, but he runs away. So obviously, what kind of protection is that? This is a false sense of protection. There's no protection for these Russian speakers. In Milosevic's real final speech, which I have listened to, he does defend himself as the defender of Serb language and identity and statehood and culture, and claims that his rival Koštunica, with whom he was in that bitter battle over the presidency, was a supporter of NATO, and NATO had harmed Yugoslavia. So if you vote for that guy, you're voting for the people who have harmed, have bombed, have maimed our people and our children and our women. And I am the true defender. So to the very last, even at his last gasp before he was overthrown, he seemed to have really believed that he was defending Serbia. By all accounts, Serbia has lost, and my linguist friend was wrong. Serbia did not win the war in the Balkans. I'm going to now talk about the impacts of these language situations as well. Well, this just continues some of these ideas. So I do think this slide really, before I get to the language issue one more time, is more about the playbook that I think Putin has followed based on the experiences that he saw in Yugoslavia. And I do think the historical precedents of Yugoslavia has given him some of these techniques, in quotes, on how best to manage the ethnic kin situation, this language situation, these rights of supposedly these Russophones that may or may not support him, but most likely most of them, at least in our recent times, shows us don't seem to support him. Referenda were organized, and referendum politics also existed in the former Yugoslavia, as I said, in the breakaway regions. And these regions vote for autonomy, and the result is we end up with these armed conflicts that occurred. The impact of war on language identity, however, in both instances shows that these active lobby states, rather than supporting their ethnic kid in the home country, actually seem to cause more harm than probably they ever dreamt they would cause. We have seen, if anything, an acceleration of Ukrainianization among the populations of even Eastern and Southern Ukraine. The popular press last year in 2022 was full of articles from the New York Times to the Washington Post, the Guardian, everywhere, online, NPR, about the cultural war that was going on in the background against the invasion, and that many people in Ukraine, especially the Russophone speakers, were making it very much their business to learn Ukrainian, to take Ukrainian classes, and as Nidashkivska has talked about, this native language activism. So if anything, this has been an accelerated process, and I'll show you some statistics in the next slide. Similarly, in the former Yugoslavia, the conflict actually created a very bizarre situation. The Serbs of Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina decided to adopt the dialect to show this broader unity with Serbia, their true national colors. The dialects of Serbia proper rather than their own Iakavian dialect, which is somewhat different. And they also chose to use the Cyrillic script, which had been elevated in Milošević's Yugoslavia as the main script rather than both Latin and Cyrillic, which had been competing in socialist Yugoslavia. And there were many anecdotal stories of people on TV, just simply speakers of radio and television programs, not being able to switch so easily to the other language. I have to say that for the Russian speakers in Ukraine who are attempting to learn Ukrainian now, I think this is not it will take, obviously, this is not something that happens overnight. A colleague of mine in Ukraine, a linguist that I spoke to on Zoom recently said, who is a Russian speaker, Russophone speaker, and she's in her 60s now, is giving all her lectures publicly and speaking publicly in Ukrainian, but she says to her, it's like, instead of using her right arm for everything to write letters or, she's right-handed. Imagine you're right-handed. She feels she's left-handed now. She's on purpose trying to use her left hand, and it isn't as natural for her, understandably. So that's when you have two different languages in the former Yugoslavia. These are two different dialects of each other, Iakavian, Akavian, Western and Eastern, as they used to be known as. And that was not even easy for the people of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Croatia to achieve. On the other hand, on the other side of the Croat side, or the Bosnian and Bosnia-Herzegovina side, or Montenegro, the non-Serbs, accelerated processes of linguistic differentiation. And I think this is also accelerating across Ukraine. Part of the Ukrainianization is also a de-Russification. So the decolonization, if you will, taking down of monuments, changing street names that refer to people like Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin and others, so icons of Russian literature and culture. That was the first slide. There was about the impact in Yugoslavia. Here's the slide that summarizes also the parallel impacts of these interventionist language policies, protection of by the lobby state. And I think they've resulted in the opposite effect in Ukraine as well as they did in former Yugoslavia. By the way, under extreme war conditions, the Bosnian Serbs and Croats adopted the Serbian dialect of Belgrade, but that has since been abandoned. That was not sustainable. Some of these things that happened in the heat of the war situation and the conflict may not last, but these are the trends we're seeing thus far. Ukrainian language is seen as Alla Nidashkivska and others have asserted a symbol of Ukrainian unity. Volodymyr Zelensky has pivoted completely to speaking Ukrainian, for instance, and the movements to remove the monuments. And then we have on the next slide, Volodymyr Pulik's statistics around, he does survey, and we actually see the numbers here, the statistics in a very broad stroke about the increase in the use of Ukrainian among Ukrainians, both among the Russophone speakers as well. And we see a shift in only 5 years. And as I said, these shifts often take a generation. It's not easy to pivot. It's not easy to shift from one language to another in everyday use. And so I think this is quite a significant statistic that we see. I'm going to come to my concluding slide, and so we can open it up for discussion. Try to show today. I think that as a sociolinguist and a person who adheres to notions of linguistic ideology, language ideology. The language ideologies that have been competing in both the Balkans and Ukraine, I think there's more than just a mere coincidence here. I think the notion that the lobby state has used to protect and promote the language of the ethnic kin across the border has had just disastrous consequences for both that ethnic kin and the home country of that ethnic group. Milosevic's, the Balkan connection here, I think, is indisputable. I do believe that I have just demonstrated that both with the fake news item and all the other evidence that I gathered, that the Slobodan Milošević, and then you look at how that translated into Putin's speeches, the Kosovo precedent, the war there, NATO, the role of NATO in the war. I think all that has to be taken into consideration when the history books are going to be written about why this war in Ukraine was started by the Russian Federation. I think fake news, one could look much more broadly at this and look more at the impact of this. So this could be something I will do in my future research, but I do think that role of fake news is very worthy here to point out. And I would like to see more connections. Obviously, as I gave this talk, a similar version of this talk recently, somebody asked, why is Sergei Lavrov visiting Republika Srpska all the time? And I think there is something there as well. There are many more connections. Not to speak of mercenaries from Republika Srpska that have been going to fight on the Russian side and so on and so forth. So there's a lot more richness to this topic of the Balkan connection. I hope I've at least given you a glimpse into what I think is a very clear and, to me, obvious connection here. Perhaps it wasn't as obvious to me in 2015, but I think now, given what's going on there in the war, I do see a real clear link between the Balkans and the situation in Ukraine. Thank you very much for your attention today. I'm going to wrap up there and maybe welcome your questions and your comments.
Thank you very much. We're opening up for questions, both online and here in person. So, any questions for Robert? Yes, first here and then yes.
Now, in the case of Yugoslavia, the language, from my understanding, is virtually the same, but the alphabets are different. In contrast to Russia, Ukraine, the alphabets are the same, but the languages are different. And it's, I think it's also interesting to know that Crimea comes from the same Slavic root as Ukraine, borderland, and that's where the word started.
No, I think that's right. I mean, obviously, it depends who you talk to, though, because the Croats will claim that their language has always been separate and it's not the same language at all. And there's been in the case of language in the former Yugoslavia, there's been a lot more language engineering in recent times. So today's new Croatian is still not as mutually comprehensible with Serbian as it used to be. The new words, the new Croatian vocabulary, and so people are, and of course, the alphabet issue also impedes some of that mutual intelligibility, as Croats are not learning the Cyrillic script anymore. So yes, they are different languages in Ukraine, and this originally a joint language, but depending who you talk to, the Croats will always say that their language was always different.
And what's the status of Ukrainian in Crimea today?
My understanding is that, but I could be wrong, that there's been quite a lot of population shifting into Crimea. Lots of people are coming into Crimea from the Russian Federation. So I haven't looked into this, but if anybody in the room knows the answer, I'd be welcome that. I don't think that Ukrainian is figuring as highly or as being protected or used extensively in Crimea today. This is more a hunch. I haven't actually studied it, but anybody in the room might know.
I couldn't give precise statistics, but I know there's been significant demographic shifts since 2014 when Crimea was annexed. So a lot of Ukrainians have moved out. And to a certain extent from Crimean Tatars, because there's also the Crimean Tatar language in Crimea, and Russian really does seem to be the
I think it was,
language.
I've read statistics even as many as 1 million Russians have been.
Yeah, very, very large.
Very large quantities. So I'm thinking it's quite marginalized. It's very much marginalized.
And I think a decision, sorry, just to add, I think a decision to use Ukrainian in Crimea may also be, would also likely be understood as an expression of a certain political stance. So might put you at risk. An expression of what? Like an expression of a particular political stance. So it might be shown as like an expression of support for Ukraine, which wouldn't necessarily be done very well.
Any newspapers in Ukrainian in Crimea?
I don't
I
know.
would sincerely doubt it.
Yeah, probably not.
I
I
would
know
s-
they, sorry. I was just gonna say, I know they shut down like some Crimean Tatar outlets.
And I would assume that in the occupied areas of Donetsk, Luhansk as well, the Ukrainian language is being eviscerated.
Yeah, just, sorry, I'll be quiet in a minute. It's not my presentation, but just an example. So, so I study activism and protest in Ukraine, and there's a couple of letters that exist in the Ukrainian alphabet that don't exist in Russian, and one of them is a letter that looks like an I, but with 2 dots on the top. And you even see instances where this letter is being like graffitied in occupied territories such as Crimea and the Donbass as like a symbol of resistance. So like Ukrainian language itself is
Right, and some of the same rhetoric, though we all in this room may know that Ukrainian is a separate language. I do think that there is a narrative that comes from Russia, because Ukrainian, modern Ukrainian is essentially based on a Western Ukrainian. Sort of, it has its roots in Western Ukraine and Taras Shevchenko and the poet and the development when that part of Ukraine has not been historically part of a Russian state, a Russian dominated state. And there is some narrative in Russia that Ukrainian as such is not a worthy standard literary language. Which I think is similar to the talk that I reread recently with my friend, the linguist, who claims the same about the Croatian literary language. It does not exist. It's a nonsense in this view from 91, just as the war was starting.
Yes, you had a question.
No, my question was answered.
It was the same. We do have a question online. Margaret Carter, did Putin weigh whether Ukrainian identity would crystallize in response to his attacks?
I think probably, my guess, again, these are quite speculative, and my guess would be he anticipated what I think a lot of the classic interventionist lobby states would have thought that, oh, they'll rally to our support. There was the Russian speakers. So this is a conflict also between the sort of ethno-linguistic nationalistic ideas that Putin is espousing, that because of their language, the Russophone Ukrainians will be pro-Russian in their politics. For a while, that seemed to be mirrored in the political, in the elections in Ukraine, say even in 2004, Russian speakers, when that famous disputed election between Yanukovych and Yushchenko, the Russian speakers, and Dominique Arel shows this, voted overwhelmingly for Yanukovych, and the Ukrainian speakers overwhelmingly voted for Yushchenko. So language can sometimes go hand in hand with political wills, but I think when you, I don't think Putin counted on this acceleration, the strength of the native Ukrainian activism, as Milošević points out, or what others have also dubbed a very strong civic identity within Ukraine of that doesn't really matter what language you speak, that you live on the soil of Ukraine, therefore you are Ukrainian and you belong in the Ukrainian state. I think he completely underestimated the strength of those feelings. I sometimes liken the situation in Ukraine linguistically, this native language idea, with that and I've studied it in some detail in Wales. Only 20% of Welsh citizens speak the Welsh language, but it is seen by the 80% whose native language is English as important to their identity, and that they must learn it at some point. So they're supportive of it. So as similarly, I think this is where Putin miscalculated, did not assume that Russian speaking means pro-Russia, wants to join Russia, which did not, obviously underestimated the depth of that feeling of Ukrainianness.
Yes, please.
This is probably an unfair question from an uneducated person in the area. But Robert, if you were looking 12 months down the road and you were the diplomat contemplating diplomatic solutions to this conflict, an assumption that it does not result in the near term and military victory by either side, what role would language play in whatever accord is finally agreed to between the Ukrainian race and Putin in terms of the use of the language in those disputed areas?
Well, I mean, if I can take my parallels with the Balkans a little farther, and I look at what ended up transpiring in the Balkans, is whatever happens, some kind of provisions of regional and minority language for people who want to claim that they're ethnic Russian or that they speak Russian and they don't have this sense of Ukrainian identity would have to, in my view, might be one way forward. So currently, 30 years after the Balkan Wars, or almost 30 years after the Balkan Wars in Croatia, at least, you do have Serbian language as a minority language. It's supposed to receive certain protections under arrangements that exist within constitutionally and also in European conventions. Similarly, I suppose if there is ever when this peace hopefully comes soon, is achieved, that there could be, and this is something that had been put in place when Ukraine signed, say, the European Charter on Regional and Minority Languages, of protecting the languages of those who might want to claim that their language needs to be used in Ukraine. So these provisions would include things like schools where, elementary school education in, say, Russian or Yiddish or whatever other language might be protected. Newspapers, radio, television, the ability to appeal to public authorities in the native language.
Robert, I have a question for you, looking again at the parallels between Serbia and Russia. What was the situation for a minority language in Serbia as far as possibility of schools for somebody that wanted, a non-Serbian? Like, is it the same?
Milošević was pretty horrific, but since his overthrow,
Right.
the Serbian state has signed the conventions, the European Charter, and has provided provisions for at least Croatian and Bosnian. No, we have Bosnian as well, because there's a large Bosnian speaking community in the Sanjak of Serbia, Hungarian in Vojvodina, and so on. So they have signed on. I think the devil's always in the details of implementation and how successful is the protection mechanisms that are put in place. But the language issues in Ukraine, and while there are parallels, the issue that I think is perhaps really been hardest to grapple with in Ukraine is the very large role that Russia played in Ukrainian society for so many decades. And I think this is where the difference might be between, say, the Balkans and sort of, I think you over there pointed that out earlier. In the language side of things, there are some important differences, which I wasn't trying to just, I'm pointing them out. I do think they're important to be there, but there are other parallels, other similarities that I think are so clear and salient that I brought them to the fore as well.
And how about in Russia, then, for minority languages? How much support is there? Schools, libraries, for Ukraine, for instance? Do we know anything about that?
The record is not nearly as good on this, because Russia, I believe, is not a signatory. I think now Russia's, as far as I remember, might not even be a member anymore of the Council of Europe, and so it has not signed on to these charters. Language policy, of course, in the Russian Federation is complex because it is such a multinational and multi-ethnic society. It's been, I think, quite a bit more generous towards non-Slavic communities. So, Central Asia, Far East, the Caucasus, but I think towards, I think part of the dynamic, and one I didn't really expand on the whole Belarusian situation, which I think is important on the linguistic side, because Russia's preferred model, of course, of the status of the Russian language would be that of Belarus, where there is a Belarusian language, but it is marginalized by the elites of Belarus, by the governments, so the Russian language is still the main language of communication. And so I sincerely doubt that there would be any accommodation on any of the regions on the borders of the Russian Federation that are the Western regions to accommodate these minority languages.
Thank you. Here's kind of a general question, when and where did the concept of a state language originate? I don't know if we have time to tackle that here, but maybe within the context.
How many hours
of-
do we have, right? Look, I think this is, not every state has a state official language, but most of the languages of our regions of Europe and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union all have elevated state languages as part of their constitutions. So when I used to teach this subject to students, we often talked about the fact that certain countries, don't even have constitutions. So the UK, Israel, there's no. The US is terrible. You know, we have state languages in states, some of our states, but we don't have a federal state language. So we don't, English is not the official language of the United States, though there have been many attempts to elevate English. Certain political parties have tried that, to make a federal law that makes English, mandates English as the official language of the United States. But we haven't gone, we don't go into that business. This is where you have to look at all sorts of political and nation state principles, but certain nation states of Europe, and they're increasingly in the Balkans, for example, Croatia, Slovenia, these are almost, a nation state is when the largest, the nation forming group is quite a significant majority of the population. And so these nation states often assert their official language as that nation forming group's main language. So Slovene in Slovenia or Croatian in Croatia. I think it's all part of wrapping up the idea of legitimacy of that nation forming group to be the dominant majority group within those nation states. So in Europe, this is very common.
Another question, I'm not sure if within the scope here, but concerning dehumanization, dehumanizing language, like during the war in Ukraine, oftentimes Ukrainians after Bucha have been referring to Russians as orcs. And what are terms of dehumanization in Yugoslavia, and how long did those terms remain problematic? Is that something that you studied or?
Well, I did study a little bit of that. I mean, the language of the enemy. This is something when the conflicts break out, there are very visceral sorts of reactions that people have towards the language of the enemy. Having been, being Jewish and being the son of somebody who was born in Germany just before the Nazis took over. For my mother, even though she could speak German, she had a very hard time listening to German, and it evoked all sorts of memories of family members and situations that people that were lost during the war or in this horrific period. And I think similarly now, this is what is, I think, something I hear both anecdotally, but also I think one can read about this, and the idea that you're suffering this horrific war, this aggression. The language of the aggressor is something that just you associate with those events, and this is quite a I think a normal phenomena that we see in war, and I think it occurred also in Yugoslavia. A demographer wrote about this, both in Northern Ireland and in Yugoslavia. There's a whole thing called your shibboleth. Your what makes you distinctly Catholic or distinctly Protestant in Northern Ireland. And apparently in Northern Ireland, it's when you recite the alphabet and you get to the letter H. And if you're Catholic, you'll say H. And if you're Protestant, you'll say H. And this could be quite in a situation where there's intercommunal violence, as there was for so many years in Northern Ireland. That could be quite dangerous as you reveal yourself. You could always deny who you are, but your H or your H will reveal who you are. Similarly, in Yugoslavia, it was the same thing with the Lord's Prayer and our daily bread. And there's a different word for bread in Croatian and in Serbian. So these are other forms of linguistic cruelty, dehumanization that we all, and it comes from the biblical story of the shibboleths in the book of Judges. The word shibboleth, which was used to distinguish between two Israelite tribes.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Yeah. What about the Hungarians in the Carpathian Mountains? What's their status?
Yes, well, there was some talk recently that Viktor Orban was quite upset about their status. So you have it. Viktor Orban and Hungary are a very strong lobby state for both the Hungarians in Romania and in Vojvodina in Serbia and also there. And, I think that because my understanding is that many of them are being drafted into the Ukrainian military. But Ukraine has been a signatory of these charters and I think has been at least trying under these rather trying circumstances, very difficult, I think, but at least in the early years to implement some tolerance towards these regional and minority languages, including the Hungarians of Transcarpathia. I don't know if you know, if Emma's still here.
Yeah,
About that.
I don't know very much about the Hungarian population. I have to say.
Yeah.
I
I mean,
can't
that's
add
the-
to what you've already said.
Yeah, that's all I really read. And Orban was critical of the Ukrainian government for, drafting them and taking them to the front lines. That much I do know. So I think it is worth watching whether intervention is towards supporting the ethnic in these other states. Because he has the same characteristics in terms of the rhetoric at least.
Any other questions? All right, well, I'd like to thank Robert Greenberg for a wonderful talk today. We learned a lot. Thank you so much. And would you like to announce your upcoming event? Please?
Yeah, on the topic of Ukraine, if you're interested, it's 6:15 this evening, just down the corridor. I'm organizing an event where we'll be hearing from Ukrainian activists and volunteers and speaking about their experiences during the full-scale invasion. So they're going to be joining us virtually, and the the event is also available online and it will be on YouTube hopefully later. So you can have a look on the Harriman website.
Do they have any Russian propaganda in the Ukrainian language, like newspapers or radio, like RT, Sputnik, of course they have English. Do they have like Ukrainian station?
So the Ukrainian government has taken a lot of measures to try and protect the Ukrainian information space from Russian propaganda since 2014. So there was a couple of Russian social media sites that were really popular amongst Ukrainians that were actually banned in Ukraine. I think using them in like a mixture of languages. I think the infrastructure of the sites themselves, and I would imagine that even if Russia was trying to put across Ukrainian language propaganda, Ukraine will be actively trying to combat it. I think there still are some issues with fake news and things like that, but I don't know if there's like an official like website or like a Ukrainian version of RT. I don't think that would be working. I don't know if
I
you
don't think I've not seen anything. of
no
that
any
sort.
kind of like specific like website. News like the Ukrainians trying to like keep an eye on it, because since like 2013-14 when the protests happened and the annexation, like it became very clear that Russia was trying to
I mean, one thing,
infiltrate
also, I mean, the use of, obviously Zelensky has used Russian to appeal to the Russian population, but there's been I think there's no reciprocal,
yeah.
if you will, in quotes, appeal from the Russian side in the Ukrainian language. And I think it probably goes along with the same
That's
mindset of that it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist. as a language.
Ukrainianization doesn't exist.
It doesn't
The
exist as a language, it doesn't
language.
exist as a nation, therefore we don't have to, they understand Russian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is like signs that are put up.
fools for their part.
Well, this is the same as the Serbs did the same things. This is Russia, this is Ukraine, this is Serbia. I mean, they put those signs everywhere when they occupied territory. They said this was now Serbia. Just as I understand the same things happening in Mariupol and places like
Yeah, they
that.
have an impact on
This is Russia. And what I think is also obviously true is that the the Kremlin's policy, and I think we haven't seen the end of this, and maybe this is something, Emma, you will be looking at when you do your research there, is really to colonize and bring, so it's sort of, you think about occupied territories that we have, let's say, in the Middle East, over 30, 40, 50, 60 years, there's been a slow-ish colonization. Here, there's a very rapid, in my view, colonization of the conquered territory. So I think they're trying to create the facts on the ground that that is in fact going to be Russia. So making the peace settlement ideas much better to conceive at the moment.
Right, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, to you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. So I think in a text from the woman Victoria Kuchinetsky, she's from Voice of America Russian Service. We'd like to email you.
Okay.
So she didn't give me her email address.